Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here and to be moderating an event about free speech for the Fort Hill Forum and Ayn Rand Institute. I think it's fitting that they should be partnering to put on an event on this topic. Ayn Rand spoke at the Fort Hill Forum frequently on several occasions about the issue of free speech and regarded it as one of the premier institutions devoted to that cause in the country. And it's really hard to think of a more fitting place to be having such an event than here. I mean, just the physical venue. Let me introduce our speakers. I'll introduce them all first, and then they'll speak. They're each going to speak for a few minutes, just some brief introductory remarks, and then most of the evening is going to be devoted to discussion with the audience, fielding questions from you. Our first speaker will be Flemming Rose, who is foreign editor at Jyllands-Posten, the Danish newspaper that in 2005 published the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. He's also the author of The Tyranny of Silence, as seen on our screen, How One Cartoon Ignited a Global Debate on the Future of Free Speech. After that, we'll hear from Jeff Jacoby, who is a journalist and columnist at the Boston Globe, and then Harvey Silverglate, who's a lawyer and co-founder and the current chairman of the board of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE, as it's nicely called, and then Onkar Ghate, who's a philosopher and senior fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. Thank you. Let me turn it over to Flemming.
Thank you. It's great to be here, although it's on a grim background. I think everybody knows what happened in Paris 2 weeks ago. It's quite rare in our part of the world that people are getting killed because of a cartoon. I think you have to go way back into history to find other examples of what we witnessed in Paris January 7, 2015. And for me, it was personal in the sense that I knew some of these people. I had worked together with them. I was a witness in the court case against Charlie Hebdo in 2007 in Paris, when they were acquitted for inciting religious hatred. I spent time with some of them at the Cannes Festival in 2008, when a French movie maker presented a documentary he had done about Charlie Hebdo, and I was also featuring in that movie. Going back to 2006, when I was at the center of well, more or less a global storm because of the publication of those cartoons that you can see here. Back then, I was of course shocked by the reactions around the world, and especially, watching Danish embassies burning in Beirut and Damascus and Tehran. But back then, it all seemed so unreal. It was a surrealistic experience, sitting in Denmark and watching people go bananas because of some cartoons. So I really couldn't relate to it in ways of taking it in. But this time, 9 years later, I was of course shocked. I've been grieving, for the past 2 weeks over the loss of those good colleagues and friends, but I was not surprised. I was surprised in 2006, but I was not surprised this time. And anyone who has been following events in Europe over the past 9 years shouldn't be surprised. Especially, of course, people working at my newspaper. We have been the primary target together with Charlie Hebdo in the Western world. Every day when I go to work, I have to go through 3 metal doors with codes, lots of security in front of the building. And we know that at least 5 terrorist attacks have been foiled against the newspaper. And Kurt Vestergaard, the cartoonist who made the cartoon of the Prophet with a bomb in his turban, luckily and narrowly escaped an assassination attempt on New Year's Eve in 2010, when an offended Muslim broke into his house with an axe and wanted to kill him. Fortunately, he had a safe room in his house where he could hide out. Right now, David Headley, a Pakistani American, is serving a life term in a US prison for his participation in the Mumbai bombings in 2008. He was the chief intelligence operator behind that operation. After having executed that terrorist attack, he in fact planned to attack my newspaper, and he was especially going after me and Mr. Vestergaard. Fortunately, he didn't find me, but he traveled to Copenhagen twice doing research intelligence, and he was arrested in O'Hare Airport in Chicago when he was on his way to his third visit to Copenhagen to maybe do some final intelligence work. So this is very real. Let me say a few things about how I think this relates to the discussion about freedom of expression and put it into perspective. I think that there are 2 factors that confront us with new challenges when it comes to tackling the issue of free speech in a globalized world. The one factor is technology. The fact that what is being published by a small newspaper in Denmark in a language that very few people can read is immediately accessible all around the world. So this digital world means that borders disappear. It also means that context disappears, and it creates a huge space for misunderstanding. The other thing is migration, the fact that people are moving across borders in numbers never seen before in the history of mankind, and it means that Denmark and almost every society in the world is getting more multicultural, more multi-ethnic, and more multi-religious. So we have more diversity both when it comes to information and when it comes to the kind of people who are living together in a society. And it really presents a challenge to free speech, because many people sincerely do believe if we get more diversity in terms of culture, ethnicity, and religion, we need less diversity when it comes to speech, which I think is paradoxical and illogical. I think that if you welcome more diversity in terms of culture, ethnicity, and religion, you should also welcome more diverse ways of expressing ourselves. That's the price you have to pay for a multicultural society. But unfortunately, politicians and a lot of interest groups do believe that we need further limitations on speech the more diverse a society we get. What shall we do? I think basically that there are 2 ways to go. You can either say, if you respect my taboo, I respect yours. If it's a criminal offense to deny the Holocaust, as it is in many European countries, it should also be a criminal offense to publish cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. And if that is a criminal offense, you should also not be allowed to publish cartoons of other religious figures. And if you are in a secular society where there should be no special treatment of religion, you would also have to ban cartoons of Karl Marx or Milton Friedman or Adam Smith or whatever person you can come up with. I believe that going down that road that may sound nice to some people will lead to a tyranny of silence, especially in a multicultural society, because at some point nobody will be able to say anything that may not be perceived as offensive to somebody. Unfortunately, we are moving in that direction in many respects. The other way to go is to ask ourselves, what are the minimal limitations we need on speech in order to be able to live together in peace? And I basically think that the key limitation should be incitement to violence. Apart from that, I believe that there should be very few limitations on speech. But it's difficult, and I know it will take a change of our culture, because a lot of people do think that they have a right not to be offended. But one solution I could think of is, when people in public office, they say offensive things, they are sent to sensitivity training. I think that maybe all of us should be sent to insensitivity training. Because if free speech is going to survive in a multicultural world, we all do need to grow thicker skins. Thank you.
Thank you, Flemming. We'll now hear from Jeff Jacoby.
Thank you, Greg. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be back at the Fort Hall Forum and back at the Old South, and to be looking at this across this room where I see not only familiar faces and new faces from past forum events, but also inspiring words around the room like the ones back there, dissent and free speech, and to know what took place in this room more than 200 years ago. When I was invited to be on the panel, I asked the organizers, I can't imagine what I would have to say that could possibly add to what would be said by someone like a Flemming Rose or a Harvey Silverglate, who are renowned for their defense of free speech and free expression. I will tell you, speaking from my perspective as a journalist, as an opinion writer, as somebody who has been known once or twice to write something that not everybody agreed with, on all kinds of topics, I'm often told, and I often hear from critics, and I often hear from people who sincerely disagree with something, that the United States needs to be more like the rest of the world when it comes to fill in the blank, when it comes to the death penalty, when it comes to single-payer health care, when it comes to income taxes. Whatever the issue is, I often have heard over many years of writing that the United States needs to be more like the rest of the world. Whenever I'm told that, I ask them if they apply that as well to the First Amendment. The United States is such an outlier when it comes to freedom of expression, freedom of speech. Some of the greatest and most powerful words ever written are the words written in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution: Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. And there's no sensitivity exception written into that commandment. There's no offensiveness exception. There's no outrageousness exception. And unlike most other societies, even most other free societies in the world, modern, democratic, advanced, Western, enlightened, free societies, the United States protects the right of disgusting people like the so-called Westboro Baptist Church to hold horrendous pickets at funerals expressing the most vile opinions. It protects the right of the American Nazi Party to march down the street in Skokie, Illinois, a community with many Holocaust survivors. It protects the right of organizers of a march in Boston who don't want gay and lesbian advocates to be part of their march to exclude them from their own private march if they wish. There are all kinds of ideas that people agree with, all kinds of ideas that people will cheer, all kinds of things that every one of us would be thrilled to extend freedom of speech and freedom of expression to, and to defend the right to do it. I dare say there are many people in the room here who have no problem. Where did those cartoons go? Who have no problem, who feel no personal animus against the cartoons. If that's your feeling, it's very easy to defend the right of Jyllands-Posten to print them. But what happens if it's cartoons or an article or an expression or a sign at a march that you absolutely abominate? Those kinds of ideas, too, need to be protected. And it's to the great credit of the United States when something like the Westboro Baptist Church case, the Phelps versus Snyder, was a case decided in the Supreme Court a year or two ago. The United States Supreme Court decided, I think it was an 8-1 ruling, 8-1, virtually unanimously, that the most hateful expressions imaginable could be displayed in the most insensitive moment and place imaginable and would be defended by the Constitution and by members of the Supreme Court from right to left. Over and over and over again, we have established this point and defended it. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was first a great jurist in Massachusetts and then became jurist in the United States Supreme Court, said two things that are often quoted. In 1919, he wrote that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. The idea being, you don't like what somebody else is saying, then you go out and you say something else. I don't think Holmes was always right about the statement of fact. Often the best test of truth isn't the idea of an idea to get itself accepted. There are all kinds of ideas that are accepted out in public that are, or will eventually be understood to be, or have eventually come to be known to be, demonstrably untrue. There are all kinds of things that are wildly popular in the marketplace. But that statement is such a great and important principle because the threat from censorship is so much greater. The threat that all of us face if we say, we, meaning we the government, we those who make the rules, we those who are in charge, we will decide what is true. We won't rely on the free interplay of ideas. We won't rely on a robust competition in the marketplace of thought and expression and views and viewpoints. We won't rely on that. We will make the decision. That is so much more threatening. Holmes also said 9 years later, if there's any principle of the Constitution that more imperatively calls for attachment than any other, it is the principle of free thought. Not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate. That is such an important principle, and it's one that most of the world doesn't agree with. That's one in which the United States of America truly is an outlier. And even Americans need to be reminded time and time again how important it is to uphold that value. Freedom for the thought that we hate. I may despise what you say, but I will defend to the end your right to say it. And it's heroes like Flemming Rose and the cartoonists who now have to live under police protection, and not only the ones in Denmark, but the cartoonist in Seattle, or not only cartoonists, people like Salman Rushdie, others who may express points of view that I don't like, that you don't like, but who had the integrity to express their opinion, and now find their lives turned upside down because of it. You should give thanks every day that you live in the United States of America, where people can express points of view that you love and points of view that you hate, and go to bed that night safely and wake up the next morning safely. Thank God that the United States is not like the rest of the world when it comes to this, and I'm very grateful that the Fort Hall Forum at Ayn Rand Institute give us a chance to get together tonight and remind us about why this principle of liberty is so important and one that our very lives can depend on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. We'll now hear from Harvey Silverglate.
Don't trust the left or the right. That's my motto. Inspired by Henry Temple, the third Viscount Palmerston, known to you folks as Lord Palmerston, the 19th century Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary of Great Britain. Palmerston famously warned quote, nations have no permanent friends or allies. They only have permanent interests, close quote. Well, similarly, free speech has no permanent friends along the political spectrum. First half of my career, it was the left that was more protective of speech. Last half, it's the right. Only the libertarians and the Randians have been consistent friends of free speech. There are ideological reasons for believing in free speech, rooted in the nature of the human spirit and the dignity of mankind. There are legal reasons. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press. I believe in these. But there is a more immediately practical utilitarian reason for the essentiality of freedom of speech, and I heard it expressed most clearly and most profoundly by an undergraduate college student, one Jason Shepard, arguing before, actually lecturing to, the Faculty Senate of the University of Wisconsin in 1999. The student speech code at that university had been declared unconstitutional in the federal district court in a 1991 case brought by student plaintiffs. But the faculty speech code remained intact because no faculty member had seen fit or had the guts to challenge it in court. The university thus faced the anomalous situation that students at the university were free to speak their minds, but faculty members were not. A free speech faction of the faculty led, you would think the whole faculty would have been a free speech faction, but it wasn't. A free speech faction of the faculty, led in part by my friend and cohort, Professor Donald Downs, challenged the Faculty Senate to rescind the faculty speech code. As retold by Professor Downs in his excellent 2005 book entitled Restoring Free Speech and Liberty on Campus, a debate was held at a faculty senate meeting that I attended in Madison, Wisconsin. In my capacity as legal advisor to the free speech faction of the faculty in January of that year, I prepared an exhaustive 21-page memorandum of law explaining why, under governing federal constitutional law, speech codes such as the one pending before the Wisconsin Faculty Senate were not only not required, as some faculty members were arguing, in order to prohibit harassment of minority groups by faculty members, but were in fact unconstitutional and hence prohibited. This memorandum, by the way, which is still what we lawyers call good law, meaning it's not out of date, not overturned, or reversed, not eviscerated by subsequent constitutional law developments, is available on the FIRE website, thefire.org. My legal memorandum was somewhat influential in the outcome of the debate and the vote. The faculty speech code was repealed. But the more influential presentation was not by a lawyer, but by the aforementioned undergraduate Jason Shepard, a Wisconsin senior who happened to be gay at a time when being gay was a supremely uncomfortable position on many campuses. Shepard's speech was at the same time profound and simple in its defense of free speech, including the kinds of insulting words that are the object of the typical hate speech code. Shepard made all of the essential and powerful arguments against restriction of speech. Speech codes elevate sensitivity over free speech and free thought. Speech codes are the enemy of academic freedom. But then Shepard delivered the coup de grace that proved to be the overwhelming and unanswerable argument in favor of free speech, including freedom from the ubiquitous and pernicious speech codes that have taken root in places that like to see themselves as free, but which are not. University campuses in the United States and various nations of Europe that march in support of Charlie Hebdo one day and in favor of hate speech restrictions the next. Jason Shepard said, and I paraphrase his words from memory, long ago seared into my brain, since I do not, alas, have a copy of the text of his brilliant speech. I am a senior. I will, in a few short months, graduate and leave the comfort of the campus and go out into the real, often mean world. There are going to be people out there who don't like gay people and who are going to want to hurt me. I am going to want to know who these hostile people are. If they are not allowed to call me a faggot or other such unpleasant names, I will not know who they are. It will be very useful for me, said Jason Shepard, to know who out there views me as a faggot and who views me as a fellow human being. If those who hate me are not allowed to express themselves, it will be more difficult for me to know on whom I should not turn my back. For my own safety's sake, I am opposed to hate speech codes. Thus did Jason Shepard carry the day, with just a little help from the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. On issues of free speech versus the totalitarianism that seeks to limit or destroy it, je suis Charlie, and je suis Jason Shepard.
Thank you, Harvey. And now we'll hear from Onkar Ghate.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks for coming. It's a real honor to be here. I think it's a very important topic. I feel very honored to be in Flemming's presence. I think what his newspaper did in 2005 and the controversy and worldwide that it caused in 2006 was very important, that this issue surfaced, and what the paper was testing is whether there's a climate of fear and of self-censorship in Europe. And I think what it revealed is there definitely is, and there's reason to feel that fear. And if one didn't appreciate that in 2005, 2006, with the demonstrations and the rioting throughout the Middle East, one has to appreciate it now, unfortunately, with the assassination of these cartoonists in France. And I want to talk, I think this episode is enormously significant because it reveals both our understanding of free speech in the West and our understanding of the place of religion in civic life. And I think, unfortunately, what this episode is revealing is how much we have lost of what our Enlightenment heritage gave us about what the meaning of free speech is and the place of religion in society. And I want to touch on both of those points just very briefly. So one, the idea that there are always limits on speech. You can't have free speech as an absolute. There's no such principle. I think is a misreading of what free speech means. It's an aspect of freedom of thought. To be able to think for yourself, to form your own opinions, judgments, to reach a conclusion that you think is true, you have to be able to think for yourself, you have to be able to interact with people, you have to be able to speak your mind, you have to be able to argue, have counter-arguments, and it has to be completely free. It's about the communication and expression of ideas, and that should be an absolute with no limits. And when they bring up that, oh, well, of course every society and every civilized society accepts that there are limits, they're not actually talking about about the communication of ideas. So there are many other acts that involve speech, but they're not essentially the communication of ideas, and they are properly criminalized, but it is not a limitation on free speech. So if someone walks into a bank and slips a note to the teller, "This is a robbery, give me all your money," and that person's arrested, it's not an interference with his speech. He's not there communicating ideas, even though he's talking. What he's doing is he's trying to threaten the people, then so hopefully they'll give him the money, and he may not even have to pull out a gun. But it's not right to think of that as, oh, we limit his speech. No, we're limiting a certain action, which is the threat of violence against someone. And I think all the similar so-called exceptions to the principle of free speech are not exceptions. We're not talking about speech in the sense of communication of ideas. And I think it's important to get that and not to let it be, well, everybody limits speech and you have to, and all we're going to debate is what limits you put. And I think that is a completely wrong way of looking at it. The second issue on the place of religion in society, I think it's startling, with some exceptions in the discussion in France, it's startling how little it's talked about that we're supposed to have a separation of church and state, and that was an American ideal. And to think of the reasons for that, and think of some of the debate. If you hold, and it is, I mean, this was after 9/11, it was in regard to the Rushdie thing, it was in regard to the Danish cartoons, and you hear it again now, that, oh no, these religions they're religions of peace, and they're being hijacked by people. I mean, Bush said that after 9/11. Now, if what religion and these monotheistic religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, if what they really brought is peace, why shouldn't they wield political power? Don't you want the people who are for peace to be wielding political power? And yet that's not the viewpoint of the American founders, and I think rightly so, because religion in its essence to take things on faith is not on the side of peace, and it's not on the side of people being able to get along together. It's, I've accepted something on faith, I have no reasons for it, I have no arguments for it, I've just accepted it. How is he going to communicate with someone else? Well, you should accept this and so on. It is, in the end, there's no such communication. And it's why there's been religious warfare throughout the centuries, and it's not only Islam, you saw it in regard to Christianity, and then all the various sects of Christianity, and the Catholics against the Protestants. And it's now often put as what we need to do is reform Islam. And I don't think that is the right way to look at it. And they talk about, say, the Protestants. And Flemming, you bring this up in the book. The Protestants, people like Martin Luther and Calvin, they persecuted people for blasphemy to the point of death, just like the Catholics. What happened in the West is religion was marginalized. It was marginalized. It was this, we can no longer live our lives by an appeal to faith. What we need is reason. And it's especially important in regard to government, that the power of government, the power to create laws and to use force and to put people in jail, that power can't be wielded by faith. It can't be that you can just do it because some book or some prophet or some authority or some pope tells you this is what you should do. The courts can't function like that. The judicial system can't function like that. The whole system of government can't function like that. And this is why they separated church from state. It is the state has to be run on rational principles that you can argue for, that you can show and that you can prove to other people. And that's not what religion is about. So we're not going to persecute the religion. You're free to do that in your private life and so, but it can't wield political power. And on the issue of Charlie Hebdo ridiculing religion, this is what happened in the Enlightenment. There were many, many figures who were then persecuted, like a Voltaire, who was on the run and was hiding out in England, who ridiculed religion. And if you read at the time in the late 1700s, 1800s, there's many preachers talking about people are becoming indifferent and even think religion is ridiculous. And they were really, really worried about that. But that's what led to we can extract this from life. We have something better than religion, which is the power of reason. And unless we get that kind of mentality and framework back versus, well, religions bring peace, the whole idea of telling someone, whether he's a fundamentalist Christian, a fundamentalist in regard to Islam, you should not have your hands on the power of government. You can't impose Sharia law or your Christian codes, outlaw evolution. So unless you have some kind of argument for why that's right, they think, no, I mean, religion is great. That's what you tell us. It's being hijacked, but we just want pure religion and we want to impose it. And it's a tremendous, tremendous problem. And it's right that there's a tremendous fear because you have these people in Islam, I mean, it's a particular issue in regard to Islam, who don't have any belief in a separation of church and state. And so they want to impose their doctrine by the power of the state. And it's a tremendous threat. And the only way to really deal with it is to get back to the principle and understanding where that principle came from of a separation of church and state.
Thank you, Onkar. Well, now we should have microphones roaming. Do we have them ready? Where should people queue up to ask questions? In the there's a microphone over here and a microphone on the other side of the room. So people, please make your way to either of the two microphones.
Hi, folks. I just wanted to remind you, if you'd prefer to tweet your question, you can tweet it to #FHF.
We're very modern. Yes. Thank you for starting us off.
I assume there's nothing that's gone on in this country controversial that pushes the limits to the maximum that any of the panelists object to in the last few years, all these cases and controversial matters. We're all okay with all those controversial.
So you're asking if any of the panelists oppose any particular events that have happened, think that any events that have happened push the limits of free speech? Would you like to suggest some events that you think might?
No.
Okay. Then.
I didn't hear the question.
He's asking if you think any of the events that have happened in America in the last several years push against or go beyond what should be the proper limits of free speech. And I think this is addressed to all four of you if anyone has such events.
Unless there's something you can suggest that I'm not thinking of, there are all kinds of things that I object to almost professionally on a daily basis, but speech and expression are not among them. If you're talking about things that I or that we think should be illegal or that should be censored or that should be punished by the government, offhand I can't think of anything. I suppose it's important to make a distinction between speech or expression or publications or ideas that are rightly condemned for being rude or insensitive or nasty or ugly, the kinds of things that good parents should teach their children not to express, that private publications know better than to put into print. But censorship, the power of law, something you can be hauled into court or thrown into prison for, I can't think of anything. And if there are suggestions from people who can, I would be interested to hear what they are.
No, Jeff, you mentioned the Skokie matter. Those neo-Nazis, so-called Nazis, never did march through Skokie. They kept battling back and forth in the courts, and they kind of gave up and had their little demonstration at Grant Park.
True.
So we never really tested that through the streets of Skokie. On a final point, Europe is different from us. We have our traditions, we have our First Amendment. They've got a different history. And virtually all the countries in Europe are against the right to propagate Holocaust denial. Does the panel argue that they should drop that objection?
I would. You and I have seen each other in previous events, so you may know, some people who are readers may know, my father is a survivor of Auschwitz, a Holocaust survivor. Of the 7 members of his family who went into Auschwitz in 1944, my father was the only one who came out alive. Needless to say, the idea of Holocaust denial is something that I personally find unbelievably abhorrent. But I made a point of writing a column when David Irving was thrown in jail in Austria, which criminalizes Holocaust denial, of saying that although I wasn't planning on losing any sleep personally at the thought that somebody as odious and horrendous as Irving would lose his freedom, that as a person who believes in freedom, I urged Austria to find a way to let him go. I believe then, I believe now, and I believe particularly because of my own family history, that even something like that, even an outright hateful lie steeped in anti-Semitism, is not something that should be illegal. You should not go to prison because, or be persecuted, or be fined, or be punished, or even have your felony punishment enhanced merely because you've expressed an idea that other people find odious, even a hateful idea, even an idea that any decent person would find repugnant. So to the extent that that's the most extreme example we can think of, I, for one, will say, yes, even Holocaust denial is something that should be protected in that robust marketplace of ideas, and if it means that people like David Irving are free to spew their hatred and their lies freely, so be it. I'd rather live in a world where you can't be persecuted or jailed for saying something hateful, because in time that leads to a world in which you can be jailed for saying things that are true and far from hateful.
I will go beyond what Jeff Jacoby...
How can you? I thought I went the limit.
Well, here I am sitting to your right. That's kind of interesting,
Only
isn't
from
it?
our perspective.
I'll go beyond what Jeff Jacoby said. I actually think hate speech is incredibly important to allow. It isn't a close question to me. In keeping with my opening remarks, it is really important to know who the haters are and how intensely they hate and whom they hate. Just yesterday, there was a very interesting column in the Wall Street Journal by Bret Stephens saying that it's packing time. France's Jews should pack up and leave. Why? Well, he goes around looking at in France, and he's looking at the various anti-Semites who are making very vicious public statements about Jews and Judaism, political leaders, people who are in the arts. One of the most popular comedians, Dieudonné, is a vicious anti-Semite, and he said, just listen to what's being said and pack up. Now, wholly aside from whether Bret Stephens is jumping the gun here, what's interesting is that he is making a judgment on how safe it is to be a Jew in France based upon things that are publicly said and being prosecuted, by the way. The comedian is currently being prosecuted for hate speech. That's totally idiotic. You want these people to speak. You want to know who they are, and you want to know what the message is in case the message is directed to you. So I really think my problem with hate speech laws is that it's idiotic.
Flemming, I know in your book you talk about this issue with Europe and America.
No, but on this issue, I also think for very practical reasons, if you want to change or influence people's thinking on these issues, it's very idiotic to ban Holocaust denial. And I think especially in a situation when you have many immigrants coming from the Middle East who in fact do not believe in the Holocaust. They are Holocaust deniers. And when they arrive, they are being told what you sincerely believe is a criminal offense. And I don't think we will be able to convince these people by banning what they believe in. The only way to fight these prejudices is to get them out in the open and confront them in class, have them air their views in public, so you can present documentation, and the kids could learn some history in school and so on and so forth. So I think it's if you want to fight Holocaust denial, you do not do it by outlawing it, as many European countries do. And when I wrote my book, I was surprised to find out that the vast majority of Holocaust denial laws in Europe were passed after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Did you know that? I mean, I didn't. I thought that they would have made sense maybe in the 50s or in the 60s or in the 70s in order to prevent a repetition of the Holocaust. So you could make the argument that denying the Holocaust would equal incitement to violence. But I don't think there is a risk of a repetition of the Holocaust in Europe today, even though, I mean, anti-Semitism is growing, and you have seen these incidences of Muslims targeting Jews in Belgium and in France. And the irony of this situation is that, in fact, the Holocaust denial laws, they were being passed in order to protect the victims of the Holocaust. They were being passed out of good intentions, but it has resulted in what I spoke about, you know, this principle: if you respect my taboo, I respect yours. Holocaust denial laws have been met by demands from other groups. You may not know, but in France, the parliament also wanted to pass a law criminalizing, banning the Armenian genocide. In Ukraine, the new government wants to pass a law criminalizing denial of the hunger in 1932-1933. In several former communist countries, you now have laws banning denial of the crimes of communism. Latvia recently passed a law banning denial of the fact that Latvia was occupied by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And the final straw was that the Russian parliament last year passed a law referring to the same passages in the Nuremberg trial like Holocaust denial laws do, basically outlawing any criticism of the behavior of the Soviet Union during the Second World War. Which means that my good friend Antony Beevor, who wrote a great book about the fall of Berlin in 1945, documenting atrocities committed by Soviet soldiers when they approached Berlin, he doesn't want to go to Moscow anymore, fearing that he may get arrested. So you know, this it illustrates the dilemma of a society where different groups have very different versions of history that they would like to protect against criticism, mockery, denial, and so on and so forth. So something that started as a way to do something good in order to protect the victims of the Holocaust has you know, ended in absurdity.
I'll just very quickly on the Skokie case. Ayn Rand said something about it in regard to free speech that I think is absolutely right. That because the question was about is it the issue of limits in the U.S. and so on. That there's no, it wasn't actually an issue of speech. That there's no such right to march on a public thoroughfare, clog up the streets, and make life miserable for the other people who are trying to use the thoroughfare. There shouldn't be that. But if you're allowing marches, then you can't discriminate against some people because you don't like what they're marching about. But that it shouldn't have been viewed as an issue of speech because marching on public thoroughfares is not an issue of speech. But so long as that's how you're looking at it, then you have to allow any speech.
Hi, this is wonderful, this panel. I wish there was more of it. I go on YouTube and I watch old debates with Milton Friedman and various people, and I just, it's so wonderful, and I just wish there were more young people who came to these sort of events to hear great thinkers discuss things freely. So my question is, having been raised in the baby boomer generation, I still, of course, my parents came from the Depression. We all came from immigrants, Italy, Germany, Poland, wherever. And we all shared a common value in that everybody came to this country seeking a better life. And everybody, in turn, assimilated to the values that were in this country, which were free speech, et cetera, et cetera. Where has it all gone wrong in the fact that now, in the name of diversity, American values are constantly being put down, and we're ashamed of what built this country and made so many people from so many different countries come here and be able to be free. Now, kids go to school, they're constantly taught that we're just a horrible country in so many ways. So once we lose those values of believing in that, then we don't believe in anything, and then speech can be attacked as well as anything. And what would you say to that? If people don't think that the amendments are that important, in that hate speech in colleges and schools, you can't say anything, then don't we lose that feeling of how important it is to allow people to speak, and then the government in turn will have power to tell us what we should or shouldn't do? Comments?
Well, just prior to this program, I think it was Jeff Jacoby and I were discussing, actually Flemming and I were discussing as well, the situation on college campuses. I noticed the question is focused on college campuses, as well it should, because I do think that there's a substantial danger facing our whole society growing out of the weakening support for free speech and free thought on American college campuses. These are the places where previously we could depend on the culture of academic freedom to come to the rescue when there were censorship wars out here in the real world. We're now in a position where, the way I put it simply, is you can say things in Harvard Yard, in Harvard Square, that you would be punished for saying in Harvard Yard being part of Harvard University. And that is a very scary prospect for somebody like me who's been around this long, representing students and representing free speech cases. And I do think it is one of the most urgent problems facing the country. It isn't commonly looked that way when we have so many problems. We have enemies out there, we have economic problems, we have political problems, Congress doesn't work, blah, 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 blah. But when you take a step back, what's really threatening the culture of freedom in this country is the degradation of respect and support for freedom on college campuses. That's the reason I co-founded the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. I'm still active with the group. It just celebrated, I say celebrated, its 15th year. It shouldn't have celebrated its 15th year. My co-founder and I were convinced this problem was so absurd, it would disappear in 10 years and we would disband. We would be the first foundation that would actually go out of business because it solved the problem. 15 years and we're still going strong. It's actually a sad comment.
I'll add another thought. I don't disagree with anything that Harvey says, but it occurred to me as I was listening to you that there's a danger in romanticizing too much the past. Things were not always so freewheeling and tolerant to unconventional and unpopular ideas in the United States either. I mean, just think of the persistence of segregation and Jim Crow for generations in this country, and the kinds of things that you could get prosecuted for and thrown in prison for and lynched for expressing or saying or writing. Think of the bigotry against every ethnic group that came to this country, experienced it. So it was never perfect, and it was never wonderful. And the reason that we have cases that led to, those were dissents that I was quoting, by the way, from Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was dissenting in cases where the court ruled the other way. So there have been cases in American history that went all the way up to the Supreme Court where the court ruled the wrong way by our lights now. So it hasn't always been perfect. However, I understand the premise of your question, and I do share your sense that something has been lost over the course of the past generation. No doubt whole dissertations and books could be written explaining what went wrong and why. I think this, like a lot of things, is part of an outgrowth of the whole experience of the 1960s. To a large extent, much of this, I would say, is a perversion of a good intention. Flemming talked before about the good intention of not wanting to give offense, not wanting to show disrespect to other people's taboos, not wanting to seem narrow-minded or closed to different ideas. And you start down that road, and you decide that you're going to give it the force of law, and you end up where you see it ending up. And as Harvey says, so much of this has been reinforced and reiterated not only on college campuses, but increasingly in grade school and in elementary school, where the lesson of sensitivity and the theology of self-esteem and the idea that you must not say anything that might make somebody else feel bad about himself or herself or their group has grown so entrenched that it leads to huge support in this country for things like hate crimes laws. We're here talking about freedom of speech, but I don't know that there's a state in the country now that doesn't have laws that add extra penalties to the punishment that can be handed out for a crime if a court determines that the crime was committed because of an impulse of bigotry or an impulse of hatred or prejudice in some way. It takes a lot of resistance to say, yes, I know your intentions are good. I know that you want to show sensitivity. I know that you don't want to be a rude person. But there's a difference between what we insist on informally and what we make part of law. And we've lost that distinction. It's one thing to say, we all understand that you raise your kids and you tell them you should say please and thank you, and it's rude not to. It would be totally different to say it's the law, you must say please or thank you. If you don't, we're going to throw you behind bars. And while that example might sound ridiculous, there are all kinds of other cases where the distinction between the moral line, the ethical line, the line of courtesy, the line of civility, the line that makes it possible for us to live together socially in a community gets melded together with the legal line. And you cross that line, and it takes an awful lot of work to cross back. I read an interview with Flemming. I can't remember where or when you gave it or where I saw it, but you were asked what were the lessons, or what are some of the lessons that you learned from the whole experience that you went through at Jyllands-Posten. And you'll correct me if I say it wrong, but what I was struck by, you're saying you thought you were big enough to make the difference. You thought the newspaper, the biggest newspaper in Denmark, was big enough to make the difference. It wasn't nearly big enough. You needed many more people, which is why it can't just be people up on a panel, and it can't just be the Ford Hall Forum, putting on a program. It's got to be a huge commitment by an enormous number of people who never find themselves in the public eye, but who are willing to insist and to stand up for the principle that just because I don't like what you say and I don't like what you stand for, I will nevertheless fully defend your right to say it and fully stand against those who are prepared to silence you. You can't just rely on a newspaper to do it. You can't just rely on an institution or an organization as wonderful as the Fire. It's got to take all of us. You need a lot more people than just an editor or just a professor or just a philosopher.
I definitely agree with the point that it's easy to romanticize the past, and one shouldn't. And I think it's not primarily an issue of trying to go back to the values that we used to have. It's much more important that what we have to do is resurrect the arguments that they had for what they're doing. So I brought up the issue of the separation of church and state. I think this was a tremendous achievement of the American founders. And I've met very few people, including older people, who have any idea of what the arguments were for why there's that principle. What I think Madison and Jefferson were the primary architects of that. There's a long intellectual tradition of discussions about toleration. And Jefferson and Madison go beyond that discussion and say these previous people like Locke are wrong in certain ways, and this is what the actual principle is. And Jefferson viewed it as one of his great achievements to be able to get this principle first erected in Virginia and then through Madison into the First Amendment. But you have to understand the arguments for it. Or take the other really, really crucial issue that one has to think a lot about, and the Enlightenment had, and the thinkers had a tremendous amount to say about this, and that's the connection between religion and force, or as Ayn Rand would put it, between faith and force. And there was a view, so we've quoted, or it's really a paraphrase of Voltaire, I disagree with what you say, I'll defend to the death your right to say it. Here's another thing from Voltaire, it's again a condensation of something he said. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. If they can get you to suspend your mind and your reasoning in regard to what is true and false, they can get you to suspend it in regard to what is right and wrong. And the Enlightenment, many of the figures are arguing there is an intimate connection between religion and force. When you understand religion as inculcating faith. And one of the ways to think about it is to take the figure of Abraham, who's going to murder his own son because God told him to, celebrated by all the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, as the great exponent of faith. And the Enlightenment said, it's not an accident that he can believe absurdities and commit atrocities. And it's these kinds of things we have to grapple with the arguments. It's not just an issue of going back to the past, it's going back to their arguments and seeing if they were right about them.
I mean, the question was what brought us in the kind of situation we are in today, where free speech may not have the kind of broad support that it used to. I think that that one of the big challenges is to re-establish a clear distinction between words and deeds, between saying something offensive and doing something offensive. And if you go back into history, we had 150 years wars of religion from the middle of the 16th century and onwards. Thousands of heretics and blasphemers were burned at the stake and killed in those wars between Catholics and Protestants in Europe. And the reason why people deserved to be burned on the stake was because there was no distinction between words and deeds. When Michael Servetus, who arrived in Geneva in 1553 and challenged Jean Calvin's understanding of the relationship between God and man, it was being perceived as a physical attack on God and on the church and on the believers, and that's why these people deserve to get killed. And it's also what you see in some Muslim countries today. Pakistan, to commit blasphemy in Pakistan equates committing mass murder. You receive the death penalty for offending God and for killing, several hundred people. So the erosion of the distinction between words and deeds is very, very problematic, and it results in this kind of grievance fundamentalism, as I call it in my book, that a lot of people do sincerely believe that publishing a cartoon mocking the Prophet Muhammad is as offensive as killing somebody. And you can also see it in the way the media phrases this. You know, the cartoons that incited violence in the Middle East, or the cartoons that triggered mass murder somewhere, as if it were the cartoons or the fact that people said something offensive that is immediately responsible for the actual violence, while in fact it's the case that people decide to commit violence. I mean, you have a choice. So to me, a big challenge for our culture in order to reinstate the principle of free speech is to be very clear about this distinction.
Flemming, can I ask you, how far would you push that? We had a debate in this country, controversy in this country some years ago over a protester burning an American flag. Yeah. And many people would say that that was an act, it wasn't speech, he wasn't saying anything. That too went up to the Supreme Court, the way everything seems to in our culture these days. And among those who upheld the conviction was some of the justices expressed the opinion, this isn't speech, these aren't words, this isn't idea, it's more of an inarticulate grunt. Right? That was the language of one of the justices. So I would say, I suppose you would say, no, that falls into the category of speech, but that's an awful lot closer to an act. How do you draw the line?
But that was
Agreed, but I'm just saying that was a point of view that there were some who peeled off from what in other cases would have been a unanimous decision. This one, some said that goes too far. That's not just...
They didn't understand symbolic speech. They had to go back to law school.
No, I would say that it's speech.
What's the litmus test for distinguishing an act from symbolic speech?
Violence.
Okay.
If you burn the flag, you do not kill people.
Okay.
Or
So it's violent actions.
Yes.
That you're. Okay,
yes.
That I agree.
I mean it's because a lot of people are saying, you know, that evil words equates evil deeds. That the distinction is not clear. That saying something evil can be, you know, a criminal offense on par with committing actual physical violence, and that's the erosion that I'm really worried about, and that I experienced myself because I was confronted with this phrasing a lot of time. That many times that. How can you sleep at night when you are responsible for the death of 200 people? And a lot of people do believe that Kurt Westergaard and I, if something should happen to us one day, like what happened to the people at Charlie Hebdo, we would be, in a way, a little bit responsible ourselves. And you heard the same after the massacre in Paris. Right. They brought it upon them, and and behind that kind of reasoning is this notion that you can equate saying something offensive with committing an actual physical violence.
Before we move to the next question from the audience, since this issue of the distinction between speech and action has come up between Flemming and Jeff, and I think it's a very important issue to understanding this, what we're here to discuss tonight. I wanted to hear if Harvey or Onkar, either of you have anything to say about that.
I always thought that was an easy case. I couldn't figure out why there was a substantial minority of the justices who didn't get it. But, you know, there's a difference between burning a flag and burning a person. And if you don't understand that, you have to kind of go back to basics. I'm totally puzzled by why it's a hard case. I know it's raised, you know, as this is the hard case. This is not the hard case. This is really an easy case. I can give you hard cases between, you know, the line between speech and action, but that one is easy. Symbolic speech is clearly speech, but yet it is much feared, much criticized, and every so often gets quite a few number of votes of people in black robes.
Gentlemen, we have...
Can I just say one thing? I also think that this has to do with a growing trend across the world that many people do believe that it is not only human beings who enjoy human rights, but also cultures, religion, and all kinds of ideologies. That because of this identity politics, that the fact that you believe in this or that God, or you identify with this and that culture, means that the culture as a set of ideas also have a right to be protected against criticism. And you can say that's the same with the flag, because it symbolizes an idea or a nation and so on and so forth. But within the UN there is a strong movement for pushing international human rights law in the direction that it is not individual human beings that enjoy human rights, but that cultures and religions and all kinds of ideas have a right to insist on the same kind of protection, and that's very dangerous.
I wanted to let you know we have about 10 minutes left, and it looks like we still have many questions, so how about a little rapid-fire questions? Do you guys think you can handle that?
I think if Onkar, if you have a brief comment on this issue we've been discussing, I'd like to give you a chance to have it, and then after that, let's have questions addressed to one panelist and brief answers to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think something like flag burning can be symbolic speech, and it's trying to convey an idea. I think there's been cases, you can correct me if there's wrong, that where someone's like throwing out the trash and they're getting rid of a flag or burning it or something like that, and that's a crime. And it's not, I don't think you need to put that as, well, it was symbolic speech. They weren't trying to say anything. So it's just because something's not speech doesn't mean the government can outlaw it. And I think the crucial issue is to understand what is in the sphere of somebody's rights and what constitutes interference with somebody's rights. And somebody speaking is not interfering with other people's rights, even if you disagree with what he says, you think it's evil, you think it's blasphemous, you're not trespassing on his rights. It's only physical actions, but only some physical actions that can trespass. And what the law does is prescribes those physical acts.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I have a question probably for Mr. Rose. Just a bit of a background. I've had exposure to censorship. I spent the first part of my life in the old Soviet Union before Perestroika. Most recently, I accompanied my son to China last summer. He delivered a series of lectures at a law school there, and we faced some of the censorships there as well. So I have some idea how those two environments differ from this country. Is Denmark one of those countries also where Holocaust denial is illegal? Are there other significant differences, with the United States? Could you name, I guess, the freest country in Western Europe if somebody deserves the title? Those are my questions. Thanks.
I didn't hear the question.
So he wants to know if Denmark has laws against Holocaust denial, and which of the European countries do you think is the freest in regard to speech?
And besides Holocaust denial, are there significant differences in other laws, speech laws, Denmark compared to the United States?
Okay, that's a good question. No, we do not have Holocaust denial laws in Denmark, but we do have hate speech laws. And in fact, we still have a blasphemy law on the books, but it's a sleeping law. It's not being applied. And I think that was a huge problem during the Khartoum crisis, because a lot of people in the Muslim world checked, our laws and said, why is David Irving going to prison in Austria and this guy is going free? You have a blasphemy law. Why don't you apply it? I hope now that it will be, in fact, repealed. All European countries do have hate speech laws. It's, in fact, a demand from the European Union. So Europe is different in the sense that in the US, the right to free speech cannot be balanced against other rights. The First Amendment is the First Amendment, while in Europe, the right to free speech is always balanced against other rights, the right to dignity or other rights. So we do have hate speech laws in all countries, and I think it's in 14 countries there are Holocaust denial laws. And my worry is that after what happened in Paris, there will be new pressure for additional laws to try to keep a false kind of social harmony. And that would mean that the people at Charlie Hebdo, in fact, were killed, lived in vain, I would say. It's very sad.
Too bad, thank you.
On this side of the room?
I have a tweeted question from Patricia. Just 1 second. For Jeff, the U.S. has hate crimes laws. How do these laws line up with your beliefs? Should punishment be worse for hate?
No, I'm strongly opposed to hate crimes legislation. It's become something of a closed controversy. It doesn't seem to be a live issue that gets debated much anymore. But I'm against it at the state level. I'm against it at the federal level. Punish somebody for what they've done wrong. Don't punish somebody because you think what he did wrong was motivated by the wrong reason. I think that if you're going to if the punishment for vandalism is a year in prison, it shouldn't matter whether the vandalism says Jews to the gas chambers, or I hate Chinese, or Hitler was right, or KKK lives, or if the vandalism says I love my mother. If the punishment for vandalism, for vandalizing private property, is X, that should be the punishment no matter what the motivation for doing it is. And it seems to me that what's particularly distressing and disturbing about hate crimes legislation is that it, in effect, says that some kinds of victims are more equal than others. That if you've been victimized because the person who hurt you had one kind of idea in mind, let's say he liked beating people up for kicks, that you aren't as worthy a victim somehow as somebody who suffered the exact same damage, the exact same harm, who was beaten up because somebody doesn't like gays and lesbians. To say that some victims are more equal than others based on the mindset of the person who harmed them, if everything else about the crime is equal, the punishment should be equal as well. So no, I'm against hate crimes laws and always have been.
If you want a reason to fear hate crimes laws, consider this hypothetical. Somebody is arrested for beating somebody up who happens to be Oriental or happens to be Jewish or happens to be whatever. And as part of the prosecution, the prosecutor gets a search warrant to see what's in that person's library, what that person has been reading. Because if, of course, there's a copy of Mein Kampf in the library, the assumption is that this person is a hater. I think these laws are very dangerous to a free people, and yet they are, right now, they're just all over the place.
Thank you.
Under the general laws of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, there's a blasphemy statute. To Flemming Rose, the great Flemming Rose, you said incitement to violence. It's very nuanced because arguably the cartoons were demonstrably an incitement to violence. How do you deal with that?
Did you hear? He says, you said incitement to violence should be banned, but arguably the cartoons were an incitement to violence. How do you respond?
Yeah.
Bet you never got that question before, huh?
First time, yeah. No, two things. No, one thing. I'll make it very short. No, I don't think that the cartoons were incitement to violence, of course, because you'll have to. You don't have to judge speech just on the way people react to it. I mean, those cartoons were perfectly within a tradition of religious satire in Denmark. We were taken to court by Muslim organizations and we were acquitted 3 times. So they are perfectly legal in every sense of the word. Now I lost my thought, sorry. I've been speaking for all day. Yes, I was talking about incitement to violence.
It's okay, the next question, we'll bring it back to you. Okay.
Yeah, okay. We've had some discussion of this already when you were talking about the distinction between speech and violence. I think it's fair to move on. Yeah. Actually, we should go to this side now.
We've heard 3 groups described tonight as promoting restrictions or reacting to speech. The EU, the campuses, and fundamental Islamists. Is there anything besides perhaps an opposition to being offended that might tie these groups together?
Is the question directed at any particular panelist or
No.
to the panel in general?
That's a good one for Onkar.
Onkar, would you care to field that?
So the fundamentalists, the EU, and the at campus, I mean, I do think in the end there's a way, but it would take a lot of argument to get to what is at root. But there is a way in which they're all faith-based. So they've all discarded reason in various ways. In academia, I mean, I was in academia for a long time getting my PhD. There's many people who don't really think that an individual has the capacity to reason anymore. And part of so we talked, the panel talked a little bit about motivation, that everyone, don't give offense and so on. You're treating people, if you take the most benign motivation, you're treating everyone like they're 6-year-olds. But a 6-year-old doesn't have the capacity to reason, to think. He might be developing it. He doesn't have it yet. And if you have that kind of view of people, the importance of free speech, which, as I said, comes from freedom of thought, the whole thing, its importance diminishes if you don't think of people like that. And so I think that's in academia. It's certainly in Islamic fundamentalism, that they don't think of a person as essentially rational, but he should be faith-based, and the EU and its whole doctrine of rights and this whole balancing of rights, in the end, I think is a corruption of the whole concept of right. The whole idea of balancing rights is already a corrupt. If a right is absolute, you have the freedom to do it. There's no balancing, whether it's freedom of thought, freedom of speech. That whole viewpoint comes from a non-rational perspective. But to get to why that is, it takes a lot of argument. There's no sort of.
But there might be a simpler explanation. All the groups you mentioned, they all think they have the right to tell other people how to think. That's what links them together, and they don't, fortunately.
And even that might be more of a strain than is necessary. It happens that in our conversation, those groups or institutions came up. The conversation could have gone a little differently and others would have come up. Believe me, you can find plenty of thought control in the media in many countries. Notice how I carefully said many countries. Everybody's got sacred cows. Every organization has sacred cows. Nobody likes to see their sacred cows skewered or insulted or slain. And the temptation, I think, goes very, very deep in humankind, very deep in our human psyche, to want to lash out against those who threaten the cows that we consider sacred. And it doesn't only have to be in a religious sense. George Orwell has Winston Smith learning the hard lesson in 1984 that if the party says 2 + 2 = 5, then 2 + 2 = 5, and you will either say that or terrible things will be done to you. And it has nothing to do necessarily with religion or with a particular kind of faith-based theology, other than there are people who insist that yes, as Harvey says, that they have the right to tell you what to do, but a lot of people think that they have the right to tell you what to do and what to say because they want you to think and to say only things that they find congenial. And that way lies madness and danger and violence and blood. And to end a note that I started with before, that's why we are so fortunate to be in a country where the First Amendment and its philosophy has such great weight and such great influence.
We have time for just one more question.
In Germany, many people are upset by the waves of immigrants from Muslim world, and their cities and towns, they are not their cities and towns anymore. So at the moment, there are kind of demonstrations going on, Germany for the Germans, so to speak, and counter demonstrations too from the multiculturalists. Any ideas on that?
So I'm guessing you guys can't hear what he's saying very well. He's saying that in Germany there's a very large wave of Muslim immigration, and there's a lot of unrest about that. There are Germans who are protesting Germany should be for the Germans, and there are counter-protests against this. What are your thoughts on this situation in Germany and Europe more generally, and on its implications for free speech? Maybe we can just go down the panel on that topic.
Or even the very culture of a nation.
Excuse me?
Even the very culture of Germany.
Is there something about the very culture of Germany that makes this an acute problem there in particular? Is also part of the question.
Well, I don't think there's something particular today about the culture of Germany. Germany is a well-functioning liberal democracy. In fact, one of the most well-functioning in Europe, and better functioning than many other countries. But Germany does have a history that is that influences its culture and what can be said and what cannot be said. But speaking about this movement, Pegida, or Pegida, I don't know how you will pronounce it in English, but a movement against the Islamization of Germany. It's a very diverse movement. I mean, yes, there are a few hardcore radical right-wing, xenophobic, maybe even neo-Nazis in that movement. But there are also all other kinds of people, and I would say that they are the majority. And they are living and being confronted with issues in their daily life in a multicultural society, which they do not think that the government is willing or able to confront. So I think, in fact, I'm a great admirer of Angela Merkel. I think she's a great leader, but I think she made a mistake by, calling names and speaking about, those people who had hate in their hearts, denouncing these kind of demonstrations. When people are taken to the streets out of real concerns about what is going on, affects their daily lives. It has nothing to do with hate, I think. It's a real concern with a lot of implications. It's not only Germany. It's Denmark, it's France, it's the Netherlands, it's the UK. It's a challenge. What do you do when societies that used to be quite homogeneous are becoming more and more multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious? No matter whether you welcome this growing diversity, as I do, or whether you denounce it. I mean, even if you welcome it, you have to admit that this creates real problems. And the big difference between the US and Europe in this sense is that in the US, immigration usually is an economic asset. Immigrants work more than the native-born population. They contribute to the economy. In many European countries, immigration is being perceived as a burden because a lot of immigrants cannot get work and they live on welfare. And if you take the percentage, or if you take the number of immigrants from outside the West who lives in our societies and compare that to the number of immigrants who are on welfare, there is a huge disproportion. And that creates resentment when you have a welfare state that is based on solidarity. And it's being challenged. So, yeah.
At the risk of seeming too lighthearted about a serious subject, as I'm sitting here, I'm remembering a comedy routine from years ago. It was recorded before I was born, but you can find it on YouTube and in recordings. Mel Brooks and I think Carl Reiner had a series of interviews in comic form, The 2,000-Year-Old Man. And Mel Brooks he played, it was a whole comedy shtick, and he played a person who had been discovered. He was 2,000 years old, and he was being interviewed on American television to talk about his life, his long and very interesting life. And I remember, I don't have the exact words in my head, but I remember that at one point he's asked by the interviewer if he remembers like the first song that he ever learned. And it was something like, yes, we had an anthem. We lived in Cave 26, and our anthem was, Cave 26 is the best, the hell with all the rest. And, he starts singing the song, Cave 26 is the best. I think, as I said before, it is something fundamental in the human psyche, this idea, Cave 26 for Cave 26ers. I'm sure that the first boat that came to this country after the Mayflower provoked all kinds of complaints that the newcomers weren't living up to the standards of the ones who were here before. Benjamin Franklin complained bitterly about the influx of German immigrants into Pennsylvania. He said that they don't learn our language, they're not assimilating. This kind of theme has been repeated over and over and over again. Some countries deal with this very deep-rooted idea by simply not allowing immigration, more or less. It's extremely difficult to immigrate to Japan or to Korea, certainly to many parts of the Arab world. If you're not Japanese, you'll never fit into Japanese society, roughly speaking. We take a very different attitude in this country, but for that different attitude and the different approach to work, there's got to be a tremendous commitment to tolerance of ideas and of peoples and of customs that we might not find congenial, and to be willing to let people live different kinds of lives. At the same time, there needs to be a commitment to those coming in to assimilate and to take on the culture of values. It goes back to one of the questions that was asked earlier as well. It's never been smooth sailing. It's never been taken for granted. In Massachusetts, here we are in the Old South Meeting House, but in Massachusetts, 100 years later, 100 years after or 75 years after the Boston Tea Party, the Know-Nothing Party swept to power in the state, won virtually every seat that was up for election. I think it was 1849. Every statewide office, every member, every seat in the legislature with the exception of one or two, all of them were taken over by the Know-Nothing Party. You think we've got a one-party state here with 80% Democratic control. Imagine a xenophobic, anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, anti-immigrant party winning 99.9% of the seats. It happened here in Massachusetts. It can happen everywhere. So is there something uniquely German about the idea of Germany for Germans? No more so, I would say, than the impulse to say America must be for Americans and Canada is for Canadians and Brazil is for Brazilians. It's a human impulse. It goes all the way back to Cave 26. And one of the reasons that we cherish freedom is because it protects us from what that impulse can lead to.
So we have one more question that I'd like to take because, as someone said earlier, there's a special interest in having young people speak on these issues and getting them involved in the discussion, and she seems to be younger than our other questioners. So why don't we take that question at the risk of cutting off discussion on this previous issue, and we'll end on this.
Okay, so with the advent of social media, people have a much more numerous amount of platforms to express dissent and to express just unhappiness with the regimes that are controlling them. So do you think that, and I've seen personally as a student that many people have taken direct initiative to confront issues that make them upset or that are offensive to them, especially with misogyny and religious issues that conflict with human rights. So do you think that it's necessary to have these discussions in the public sphere, or is it okay to have these discussions in the private sphere, and does that make it illegitimate or just not as effective? So,
could I just ask you, because I'm not sure I'm understanding the question, and I might have to repeat it to them.
Is it
are you
necessary
considering
to have
the social media the public or the private sphere?
The private sphere, in the sense that people are now anonymous when they create these spheres of dissent. So is it necessary for people to have a face and a name to their opinions in order to have effective discussions?
Okay, so she's saying that the advent of social media, Twitter and so forth, lets many more people express their opinions, and if they want to do it anonymously, how does that change the situation with regard to the need for freedom of speech? And in particular, is it important that people give their name and their personal information with their opinions rather than expressing them anonymously? Is that?
Yeah. Okay. And I've just seen a lot of effectiveness with those spheres of dissent on Facebook and on Twitter, and specifically with Syria. And people have shown that there is some kind of effectiveness in having just a larger group of people forming some kind of coalition rather than being individuals having to take initiative to stand up against a cause.
Okay.
So.
Did you guys hear that, or do you need me to repeat that? She's saying she's seen anonymous activism on, I don't think you mean not the group anonymous, but not people who aren't saying their names being very effective in activism against misogyny and other problems on Facebook and Twitter and so forth.
There are a lot of arguments for and against anonymity in public discourse, but the Supreme Court, in a very famous case involving the NAACP in Alabama, said that the NAACP did not have to give over its membership list to the state of Alabama. For obvious reasons, the members of the NAACP back then did not want their names known and their membership known. I think that's probably a salutary opinion even now, but I understand there are arguments against it. That's what the Supreme Court currently says, and I think it's probably wise.
I think there are times when anonymous activism and expression can be effective, and times when it can be self-destructive, but I think that it should be up to private organizations and private companies and private forums to be able to decide what their rules will be. We don't make you give your name to ask a question. That's the right of the Fort Hall Forum to make that choice, and the right of the Old South Meeting House, and the right of the Ayn Rand Institute. On the other hand, I've argued for a long time that online opinion sections in media websites, for example, should crack down severely on allowing anonymous comments. My feeling being, if they want to comment on, let's say, the Boston Globe's website, they ought to be willing to put their name to the opinion that they're going to express. Those who will thereby not be willing to express themselves have lots and lots of other options. So far, my argument, something I'm used to, hasn't carried today. But I think that it should be a matter for the proprietor of any given forum to decide. Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or any social media should be free to make rules that it thinks works best for its members. The question has always become so much more difficult when the government gets involved, and when it becomes a matter of not just private organizations acting privately, but the force of law being brought in to compel people to be identified or to persecute people who are identified because of something that they've said. That's when you come to the most difficult part of all of this, and my instinct is always keep the government out, but give the maximum leeway to free organizations and private organizations to act freely and privately.
I think we've reached the end of our time, so I'd like to invite everyone to thank our panelists. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming here tonight to listen to this panel.
And everybody should join the Fort Hall Forum.
Yes.